Good afternoon. So nice to see all of you. We're getting started promptly at 3 o'clock. A couple of announcements before we get started. Next week at 6 o'clock in the Student Union Atrium, our Student Government Association will be having its Executive Officer debate. Of course, as the head of the American Democracy Project, it's my job to remind you about all things civic engagement, and especially the importance of your involvement in your local government. And SGA is your local government as students here at the university. So I hope you'll participate in that next week, 6 o'clock. Also, just to get you ready, spring break will be here before you know it. And immediately after spring break, you will wander over here and you'll see the sign that says, "You forgot." We're meeting in the Todd building. The very first lecture after spring break, that Monday after spring break, we're meeting in Todd 350. We're printing our own copies of the preamble to the Declaration of Independence in the font that the newspaper printed at the time on our replica Franklin press. So we will be on the other side of campus, so just start getting that in your head. I also we have 2 of our elective Beyond the Classroom experiences that same week after spring break that I have flyers for. One is about the Revolutionary Press. It is that before our lecture on Monday after spring break, and the other one is the impact of the American Revolution and its ideas on the entire Atlantic world. That's the History Department's annual Strickland lecture. So those are coming up as well right after spring break. If you want a flyer to remind yourself or to invite someone else about those, please do that. And then after spring break, we'll be shifting to look more at the international aspects of the American Revolution. We'll be looking at its interactions with the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, and of course the Atlantic world with the Strickland lecture. And then, to wind up the semester, we'll move to music and to space. So always a good way to sort of wind things up. There's also information over there on the side about ODK, Omicron Delta Kappa, which is a leadership fraternity, requires a 3.5 GPA if you are interested in being a leader. And you should be, because you're all awesome MTSU leaders already. Think about potentially joining ODK. There's information there. Any questions? Yes, Trevel.
I have an announcement.
Okay.
If y'all come out to the presidential campaign, I actually will be speaking. I will be debating. I'm running for SGA president. So if y'all can come out, that'd be awesome. I'd love to see y'all there.
Yep. Excellent. Again, leadership from the grassroots. Here we go. All right. Well, today it is my great pleasure and privilege to introduce my dean. Dean John Weil is dean here of the Honors College. He's been dean of the Honors College since 2008, which I think makes him by far the most tenured dean in the university. Yes, most senior dean in the university. As if that wasn't enough of a wow factor, he has published more than 50 books, edited or written more than 50 books dealing with the U.S. constitutional amendment process, American historical documents, and especially important symbols in American history. So who better to talk to us about the revolutionary nature of the Declaration of Independence but Dean John Weil.
Thank you. So, I hope we all know by now that this year marks the 250th anniversary of the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. It's the semi-quincentennial. And to give another announcement, many of you know that our convocation speaker this year, our book is going to be Declaring Independence, Why 1776 Matters. Some of you well, at least some of the faculty and maybe some of the visitors we have may have met Edward Larson. He wrote a book on the Scopes monkey trial several years ago and came and talked about that, and he's a delightful speaker. So for the first 100 years or so of our history, Independence Day was an occasion for something like you're having today, speeches. Many of them were quite long. I have collected probably 2 or 3 dozen, and if I remember correctly, University of Missouri has this extensive collection of them, which, who knows, maybe in retirement I will go try to read them all. But most of the Independence Day speeches focus specifically on the Declaration of Independence and what it means. And it has been widely regarded as the essence of what we might call an American creed. As much as anything, it identifies, we think, who we are as a people, sometimes referred to as America's birth certificate. Today's celebrations, unlike this lecture series, don't usually feature long speeches, and this won't be too long, but long speeches on the Declaration of Independence. We tend to go more for picnics and fireworks and sports events. It's my understanding we're having some kind of event Mr. Trump is putting forward for wrestling event, something like that on the 4th of July to celebrate our semi-quin. In any event, the revolution is in some ways the American equivalent of the Jewish Passover. It represents, just as for them the Passover represented the release from Pharaoh, their nationality, so in a sense that's what we're celebrating at Independence Day. Our independence from a distant king whom we feared was attempting to become a despot. Now, many of you know the primary author, and we'll go through this a little bit later, the primary author of the Declaration of Independence was Mr. Thomas Jefferson. I graduated from his university, and if you hear me saying Mr. Jefferson, I can't help it. You pretty much, they won't let you graduate unless you get that sort of under your belt. But toward the end of his life, if I remember correctly, it was 1823, so 3 years before he died, some people questioned what the Declaration of Independence was about, and some of them essentially accused him of being a plagiarist. And he responded to the effect that it was never his intention to articulate new principles, but instead to express the common sense understanding of the American people. So to get to that understanding, I want to start with a little bit of history. All of you know what we today call the United States of America began with 13 colonies south of the area today we call Canada, who all eventually, most were founded by and all were eventually under the tutelage of Great Britain. For in the early years, partly by necessity and partly simply because they were occupied with so many other matters, Britain exercised what Edmund Burke referred to as salutary neglect, meaning, yes, there were regulations dealing with our trade and commerce and that sort of thing, but for the most part, England was too far away and the means of transportation were not quick enough that they had to empower the colonies to do a good bit of their own self-governance. I grew up in Virginia, and one of the things that we always emphasized was the House of Burgesses, their equivalent of a Congress or a state legislature, was founded in 1619. And had I been born and raised in New England, undoubtedly I would have heard about the Mayflower Compact of 1620. So in the early years, the colonists, generally they would enact their own legislation. These were subject to veto by the king and through other things, but for the most part they ruled themselves. Now, this ended after what Americans call the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763. It was actually part of a worldwide conflict between France, which was a dominant Roman Catholic power of the time, and Great Britain, which was a dominant Anglican power, one of the major Protestant denominations of the day. And after that war, Britain looked at the situation and they said, well, many of you know, the end of the war, Canada, which had been largely ruled by the French, was given up to England, sort of as a trophy of war. And one benefit of that, or one result of that, was that the colonies and England no longer faced the same common enemy. You didn't have French Canada to the, well, you don't have French Canada to the north. You still had Canada, but it was by Britain. And so there wasn't, in some ways, that probably gave colonies greater independence than if that threat had remained there. And in the meantime, the British looked at what they had done during the war. Now, from the colonies' perspective, they had probably experienced the greatest number of casualties in terms of it was basically on their soil there and in Canada. So lives had been lost. Colonials had fought on the British side. I'm sure probably some of them were even paid by or supported by the colonial legislatures. But from the British side, they had sent over a lot of troops, many of whose lives were lost. It had cost them a lot of money, and it seemed only time for them. Actually, the British attitude is not unlike President Trump's attitude toward Europe. We've coddled you enough. You need to pay more. And the result was they began enacting taxes on the colonies. And if you can't get through grade or high school in the United States without learning about the stamp tax and the Townsend duties and all of those. You're probably familiar with that. And many of you also know that the colonies disputed the right of the English Parliament, which is their equivalent of Congress. They disputed the Parliament's right to tax the colonies. But they did so from a very fundamental British position. Most Americans who were here, and they wouldn't have even called themselves Americans probably, they would have been Virginians or Pennsylvanians or whatever, but most of them believed that when they or their ancestors had immigrated from England, they had brought their rights with them. And in fact, Mr. Jefferson in 1774 would write a pamphlet talking about the right of British Americans. So 2 years before the Declaration was written, he was still asserting, we're Englishmen, and I'm using Englishmen because they were the ones that had political rights and the right to vote. But he was still considering that way. So even many of you know, so Parliament claims the right to tax. Americans say we're British, and the fundamental principle, now Britain doesn't have, many of you know this, they do not have a single document that they call a constitution. If you go to England, don't ask to see their constitution. Now there is an English constitution in the sense that they have a way of doing things. And these include a number of documents, one of the most fundamental of which was signed in 1215. Does everybody know what that is? Okay, the Magna Carta, and it is reiterated several times subsequently in British history. And one of the principles, now the principle initially applied to noblemen. It didn't apply to every subject of Britain, or what we would call a citizen. But one of the fundamental principles that was articulated in the Magna Carta was that of no taxation without representation. And so the notion was, if we're not represented in Parliament, and they probably didn't want to be represented there, but because we're not represented in Parliament, Parliament does not have the right to taxes. And so many of you know Britain would enact taxes. I forgot about this. Okay. These are 2 books I've written on the Declaration. So we're going to go to King George, keep him up for a little bit. I probably should have started with the Parliament. But nonetheless, initially Americans were making an argument from English rights. And how do you get by with this? How do you claim to be Englishmen if you reject the authority of the British Parliament? And the answer is, okay, one foot too far. The answer is you look at Britain's government and you say, well, Britain is ruled by a king. And then you look at your charters and you say, who signed our charters? It's not signed by Parliament, it's signed by King George or one of his predecessors. I knew that was going to happen. Okay, let's put that to the side. That, by the way, is why I don't wear a wedding ring, because every time I give a speech, I end up losing it, and when I'm in a theater, I often have to crawl beneath the seats in order to get it. But where were we? Let's go back. So, Americans said, we're British because we remain loyal to George III, and we're going to send petitions to him telling him how badly Parliament is treating us and hoping that he will help. He pretty much ignores or repudiates these petitions that come to him. But even after fighting breaks out, many of you know April of 1775, fighting breaks out between American soldiers at Lexington Concord and the British. Even after that, many of the colonists represented in the Second Continental Congress, which is meeting in Philadelphia, they're still reluctant to snap the ties with Great Britain. And this takes us to last week's lecture that Dr. McDaniel did such a good job with. On January 1st of 1776, a recent immigrant brought here in part under recommendation of Benjamin Franklin named Thomas Paine writes a pamphlet called Common Sense. And it truly is one of the greatest propaganda pieces that was ever written. And I don't say propaganda so much in a negative fashion as it was just a great piece of advocacy. Lots of references to Scripture, which would have appealed to a lot of people in the colonies. Very sharp, pungent language that once you read it, it was hard to forget it. It was read in the taverns. It was read on the battlefield. And essentially, Paine, as you'll remember from last week, says, why are we remaining loyal to the king? What good is kingship? Go back to the Bible. God warned the Israelites about establishing a king. What do kings bring? War, oppression. How competent are kings? Well, look at any family. Maybe one generation will reflect the parent if you have a really great parent, but go 2 or 3 generations down and you're going to find somebody who has no business being on any throne. And so basically he says this whole notion of hereditary succession, this whole notion of kingship is flawed, plus which we got a really intolerable king and we need to get rid of him. Now, we tend to think of the revolution as one movement, but actually each colony should probably be treated in somewhat different fashion. Some colonies were ahead of others, particularly Massachusetts and Virginia, probably to some extent Pennsylvania. Elsewhere, it sort of waned from one state to another. And in fact, our first lecture, remember, was about the revolution in Tennessee. And you remember people in Tennessee had sort of mixed motives when it came to the revolution. They were primarily, the people in East Tennessee were primarily concerned about expansionism, about making a good fortune rather than necessarily the kind of liberty that we would prize today. But in May of 1776, the Second Continental Congress tells the states that it's time for them to go ahead and begin replacing their colonial charters with their own state constitutions. And many of these, in fact, most of these were prefaced with a Declaration of Rights. One of the most notable of which was one by George Mason of Virginia. And if you look particularly at that first couple paragraphs, you'll find there's great continuity between that and Mr. Jefferson. But again, remember Mr. Jefferson says, I'm not trying to be original. You asked me to write up a declaration. I'm going to try to summarize what the opinions are. Well, he's just arrived from Virginia, so look at that first paragraph. All men are born equally free and independent, have certain inherent natural rights of which they cannot by any compact deprive or divest their posterity, among which are the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the means of acquiring and possessing property and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. If you're familiar with the first paragraph or two of the Declaration of Independence, very similar. Virginia ratifies that in June of 1776, and that same month, and I should have a separate slide on this that I don't, but one of the representatives from Virginia, namely Richard Henry Lee, introduces 3 resolutions at the Continental Congress. And these resolutions call first for a Declaration of Independence, second for the forming of foreign alliances, and thirdly for the creation of a new constitution. And you can sort of see how they would all fit together, right? If you want foreign allies, under the laws of war, countries are not supposed to intervene in domestic affairs of other countries. So typically, countries are wary of intervening in civil wars. But if you can convince the world that this is no longer a civil war, they're now declaring their own independence, you have 2 countries, then you're going to be able to get allies. And similarly, just as you've told the states, we're not advocating for independence, we're not advocating that you do away with governments, we're advocating that you create your own governments. Well, if we're no longer going to be loyal to Britain, Continental Congress doesn't have any basis other than sort of consent. There's not a document underlying it. It's time to replace that with what will eventually become, or initially become, the Articles of Confederation, and will eventually become the U.S. Constitution, which was written in 1787. So, Congress moves ahead with this, and Congress does then what it often does now. It appoints a committee of five individuals, 3 of whom are pictured here. Mr. Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Virginia, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Robert Livingston of New York, and Roger Sherman of Connecticut. So you can see they're trying to make an attempt sort of to represent all the different areas of the country. Mr. Jefferson, who has written this book that I mentioned earlier, Summary View of the Rights of British Americans, he has chosen to write the initial document, which is then somewhat revised by, fairly lightly, by Mr. Adams and Mr. Franklin, and then is debated before the Continental Congress. And I believe Dr. McDaniel mentioned that during these debates, I think it was about 1/4 of the document, maybe closer to 1/3. 1/3 or 1/4 was actually excised or changed, including, and you'll remember the long section that Dr. McDaniel read to you about how Mr. Jefferson was trying to condemn the king from bringing slaves here. Didn't sit very well because he was a slave owner and was profiting from the institution. But nonetheless, Mr. Jefferson writes the documents, and in the meantime, Congress is proceeding ahead. And here's a sort of a historical irony. When does the United States declare independence? Does anybody know the day? Yes?
Wasn't it January 2nd?
You don't mean January.
July.
Yeah, okay, exactly, yes. So the resolution, remember 3 resolutions, the first resolution is actually adopted on July 2nd, 1776. And I should have brought it, but I didn't. Mr. Adams has a letter to his wife Abigail, whom we all know and presumably love, in which he said, this is the day. July 2nd, we've declared independence. It will herever after be celebrated by bonfires and speeches and picnics and whatever. And he was largely right, only he got the day wrong. Well, he didn't get the day wrong in a sense, but he got the day we commemorate it wrong. And by the way, this is President's Day, and I should say, if you haven't been watching, it started as Washington's birthday, then it became President's Day to incorporate Washington and Lincoln, and then some states now celebrate it, some don't. Some call it President's Day, some call it, Labor, I don't know, whatever they call it. So something similar happened here. And one of the reasons you can probably figure out. So independence is declared on July 2nd. 2 days later, they adopt the Declaration of Independence, which is the explanation as to what the nation was doing. And that explanation has two primary audiences. One is domestic. You want to get people in the United States on board. This is what we stand for. This is why we're fighting. But secondly, remember, you're trying to convince the rest of the world we mean business. If you hate Britain and like us, or at least don't hate us, send us money and we'll work against a common foe here. Now, why do we celebrate on July 4th? Well, one reason is right there. The first printing of this, which is within a day or two of its being adopted, right at the top has July 4th. The second is a little bit more bizarre, and apparently, come the next July 3rd, or the next July 4th, somebody says, you know, this has been a year now since we declared independence, we ought to celebrate. And they say, okay, well, let's do it tomorrow. So they celebrate essentially on July 4th. We begin celebrating on July 4th, and it has continued ever since. Now, what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about how the document is structured and what it says, and then I want to get to the question, which is, I guess, really the title of my speech, is sort of how revolutionary or not was the American Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution in general. So let's start with, what's the part that everybody knows in the Declaration? Pardon? Yeah, the opening paragraph or so. And by the way, who knows what the first words are? Well, you do know. Okay. Okay, now you know. Okay, I don't know how to hide it once it's up there. You know, if you ask most people what the Declaration starts with, they'll probably say, we the people. No, that's the Constitution. Okay, when in the course of human events. You probably know that. So let's go, I guess here it would be like really the second paragraph. The strange thing in some ways about the Declaration is we know the first paragraph, or we know this second paragraph, and we probably remember a line or two from the end of the document, and the rest is sort of flyover territory. The largest part of the document we largely ignore today. So we're going to talk a little bit about what it is. Okay, so the first part here, remember I said that the Declaration is a kind of American creed. Now, this is actually, it raises some questions that I don't know that I have the answer to. Why does Mr. Jefferson, instead of, I mean, part of it you get it. Okay, so he will later talk about, you know, right, let's start at the beginning. When one people, that would be America now, who used to claim to be Englishmen, dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, that would be the British people, then we need to tell the world what we're doing. So he's talking about an equality of nations. We're no longer going to be subservient to Britain, we're now going to be on the same level with them. But why does he next go into, and here's what we believe. We believe that all men are created equal. They're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Does he need that in the Declaration? I don't know. I mean, it gives you something to rally around, right? Yeah, I can go along with that. You know, we're all equal. And particularly if I'm in the field, right? If I'm in the field fighting the British, well, like if I'm George Washington, I would be a large landowner. But many of these are probably not. They're probably, you know, people who have rallied to the cause of independence. And so he puts this on a very high plane. This is what we stand for. And most of you know, who's the philosopher probably that would say had the greatest influence on, pardon? No, I mean, you're thinking, good guess though, because the most notable signature on the Declaration is going to be John Hancock, one of the. You're right. Yeah, John Locke is generally considered the author of the second two treatises on government, an English philosopher, and he stressed particularly the right of property. But if you had to find a trinity among Locke's rights, they would be, well, he's a social contract theory. We would, if we were in a state that had no government, a stateless state, we would gather together to protect our lives, our liberty, and he would probably say our property. Now, Mr. Jefferson widens it out a bit, but if we went back, see if I still have it up there. If you go back there, he's actually imitating sort of what Mr. Mason did, the enjoyment of life and liberty with the means of acquiring and possessing property and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. So he broadens it out from property, and by the way, he doesn't guarantee, and this may have something to do with is the Declaration of Independence, how revolutionary is it? He doesn't say we're going to guarantee happiness. And any politician who tells you that, just ignore him. What he does say is we're giving people the right to pursue their view of happiness. It's an extension of liberty. Does that involve property? Absolutely. For most of us, it does, especially if you're a small business owner, but maybe even if you're a homeowner. Having your own home, as opposed to living on somebody else's property, probably gives you greater liberty, greater security than if you did not. So that's, and then he goes on to give what I would say is a fairly prudent view of revolution. Prudence will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient reasons. But when a ruler evidences a long train of abuses and usurpations, it's the right of the government to, it's the right of the people to choose a new government, laying its foundations on such principles as they think will promote this happiness. Now, let's talk a little bit then about how the Declaration goes from there. So we have this creed. Then you'll notice there's something like 27 accusations, and they all begin, or the first 25 or so begin with two words. He has. Who is he? King George III. He has called our assemblies together at untimely places. He has negated our laws. He's refused to do this. He's slaughtered our people, etc., etc., etc. All the accusations of a war that starts because we don't want to be taxed by Parliament without our consent go to the king. Why? Why not indict Parliament? They're the ones that enacted the taxes. Why the king? Pardon? Well, yes, but what else? Yes.
Does he have to have a seal? Does he have to approve?
Well, yeah, you sort of think of a king's seal, but it's something, yeah.
Was there ever requesting help from the king about the parliamentary?
Well, I mean, basically, he's already accepted the argument that we've never accepted the Parliament's right to taxes. We don't agree with parliamentary sovereignty. And what was the one remaining tie left prior to paying? Well, we have allegiance to the king. He gave us our charter. We're going to work through him. The king is unresponsive, so now the only remaining tie left in terms of government is the king. So all these accusations are directed against the king. There is a point where he will say he has combined with others to uphold acts of pretended legislation. That's the reference to Parliament, but we're not going to call it by name because we don't recognize its authority here. So then we get to the last paragraph, and this is the one that probably all of us know. For the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to one another our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Many of you know this document was it was printed shortly after July 4th by John Dunlap, and I think this is probably the Dunlap print. This will be what you'll be doing when we do the thing with the local press here. It's later engrossed. It's written out sort of in the cursive of that particular time. And contrary to most pictures that you see, it was not signed on a single day. That document was signed somewhere between August 2nd and January. And delegates would leave and come back and replace others, and they would add their signatures. When they did, many of you know, this would have been considered treasonous in England. Benjamin Franklin is alleged to say, you know, we must all hang together or we're going to be hanging separately, meaning hanging separately from English nooses. So their names are not actually revealed. You would, well, two names, the secretary and maybe Hancock, I can't remember. But the other names are not actually revealed until January of 1777. Now, we sort of know then what the Declaration says. Now let's talk about how revolutionary is it? And we had the seeds for this planted, I think, in Dr. McDaniel's lecture of last time. So we'll sort of start there. So one interpretation of the American Revolution and the Declaration is that it is a relatively conservative document, which is to say, it doesn't call for worldwide revolution. It doesn't call for redistribution of property. It doesn't call for the elimination of church. Now, there are some who will argue for separation of church and state, but they're not saying we need to hang all the priests or we need to confiscate all church property or the like. Basically, they're saying we want the same power that Britain has over us. And so Edmund Burke, that I believe Dr. McDaniel mentioned last time, often considered the father of conservatism, he argued that, you know, he supported essentially the American Revolution, but when the French Revolution later came, he said this is totally, you know, this is unbounded. These are people who know no limits. And interestingly, prior to the guillotine, prior to Robespierre, Marat, and the others, Burke is predicting the French Revolution is going to end up in an absolute mess because people have these abstract rights and they have no idea how to enforce them. They're anti-institutionalism. It's sort of the beginning of the end. So if you compare that to, you know, prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light or transient reasons. And then we know historically the revolutions that followed ours, French Revolution, that ended up with a lot of people killed. And ultimately, it ended up with a dictatorship, Napoleon. Then you go to the revolutions that have imitated it, Russian Revolution of 1917, the Chinese Revolution of 1949. Millions of people literally died as a result of both of those revolutions. They were not simply about replacing one government with another. They were essentially attempting to, you know, bring about a whole new world. Now, that being said, the American revolutionaries actually thought that they may think they were more revolutionary than we think so today. So, hopefully, if as a student you have at least enough for $1 to carry around with you. What does a Great Seal of the United States say? You have to know your Latin. Well, that's a good one. And let's see if that's actually on here. You know, it is adopted initially as our motto, but I don't think it's on here, but I could be wrong, okay? This is right below. You have a I don't think you can read it from here, but if you have a dollar bill, you'll see a pyramid with the eye of God on top. And then below there's a Latin phrase, Novus Ordo Seclorum. You may know what that means? A new order of the ages. That sounds pretty revolutionary, doesn't it? Now, interestingly, and I'm trying to work on I have been I got actually distracted from this because we're thinking of doing a book on these lectures, and I started on this. And I realized that there's a long history in the New World of thinking that we're really up to something. In fact, I missed one of the books. So there is a book that was recently published. We couldn't afford him, by the way. Walter Isaacson has written a book called The Greatest Sentence Ever Written. And guess what he picked out as that sentence? Yeah, yes, New Order of the Ages. What sentence do you think he picked out? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, etc., etc. Now, I think I quarrel with him. I think they're great words. I admire them. I believe them. But maybe love your neighbor as yourself. Maybe give me liberty or give me death. I can think of a lot of other phrases that I think are probably just as great a sentence as that one. But prior to the American Revolution, if you go all the way back to probably 30-ish, any of you familiar with a model of Christian charity? Anybody? Know who wrote it?
Was it Wise?
No. Okay, well, you got the right letter to start the last name with. John Winthrop, who's going to be governor of Massachusetts, he writes this sermon. And he basically says, and this was Ronald Reagan's favorite phrase, he buffed it up a little bit, but he said, we're in covenant with God, and we're going to create a city on a hill. And the whole world will either see that we've been favored or disfavored by God. And Jonathan Edwards, probably the greatest theologian in American history, comes along and he says, it may just be that the settlement of the United States of America will bring in the millennium. We may be bringing in the 1,000-year reign of Christ. So there's a pretty long history of people in the New World having a fairly high opinion of what their enterprise is going to be. And I think to some extent this is actually reflected. I think you can clearly say that in some ways Mr. Jefferson and I put this in here. Certainly the Revolution, the ideas of the Declaration have had importance throughout American history. They were a primary factor in abolitionism. They were a primary factor in women's suffrage. They were primary in the arguments that Dr. King made in the 1960s and others for equality, so they've certainly been important. But look at this. Who could think of a more conservative kind of character than Mr. Washington? And by the way, one of the reasons the American Revolution turned out the way it did, and not the way happened in France or in Russia, was the person who could have claimed kingship turned it down. And he is most frequently likened to what Roman figure? Does anybody know? No. Cincinnatus. Who said back there? Yeah. Okay, Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus was, so the story goes, he was plowing in his field one day, and the Romans come and say, we're about to be wiped out. You've been a general, come help us. He goes, rallies the people, wins the victory, and they say, we'll make you Caesar, we'll make you governor. He says, no thanks. I'm going to go back to the farm. And George Washington did this not once, but on at least two or three occasions. When the army said, let's go march on would have been Pennsylvania, let's go march on Philadelphia and get our pay, he said, no, we're not going to use military power. The end of the war, he hands his commission to Congress. And then when he becomes president, he sets a precedent that lasted until Franklin Roosevelt, namely a 2-term limit. He was not going to be a hereditary ruler. But look at what he says. Foundation of our empire, and that word itself is somewhat interesting, was not laid in the glooming age of ignorance and superstition, but in an epoch, I think it's actually an epocha is what he said, when the rights of mankind were better understood and more clearly defined than in any former period. Meaning, we set up a new government and we know more than our ancestors did because we know about checks and balances and separation of powers and federalism and a lot of the mechanisms that have actually worked fairly well for 250 years. And then this is, now all of you know, I hope, one of the things that made the 4th of July what it is today happened 50 years later. So 200 years ago, what notable coincidence occurred? And historians are still writing about it. What happened on July 4th of 1826, 50 years to the day that the Declaration of Independence was adopted? Right. Both Mr. Jefferson in Virginia and Mr. Adams in Massachusetts, who had worked together for the Declaration, later split into rival parties and then renewed their friendship. They both die on the same day. And to many people in America, this was an alignment of the stars that had to be providential. This was God's way of saying, yes, I approve of this enterprise. By the way, Mr. Monroe dies 5 years later on July 4th. Is it 36 when Madison dies? He almost makes it to the 4th, and his doctors actually come and say, you know, we could juice you up a little bit if you'd like to live to the 4th. And he says, nah, you know, right in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, that's enough for me. Rough translation of what he said. Okay, but look at this letter. This is interesting. So Mr. Jefferson is invited by the mayor of Washington, D.C., to come and give a speech on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration. He's not going to make it that long, but Whiteman doesn't know that. But Mr. Jefferson wants us to know what the Declaration meant to him. And he says it's the signal of arousing men to burst the chains under which monkish ignorance and superstition had persuaded them to bind themselves to assume the blessings and security of self-government. And then he connects it right to the unbounded exercise of reason and freedom of opinion. All eyes are opened or opening to the rights of man. So that sounds pretty revolutionary, doesn't it? So I think it sort of depends on what lens you want to look through. The American Revolution has not inspired the kind of, it's at its best, America has not succeeded by force of arms, but by force of the principle. And this principle of human equality and dignity, that's what sort of makes America what it is. And that's what I hope we're going to be celebrating on the 250th. And with that said, let's see if we have any questions or comments. I hope. Anybody? This is an exciting time to be alive, by the way. My wife and I tried to get married on the 4th, I was going to say 1776, but it was 1976, and we realized everybody was out of town, so we got married a week earlier. But I've always hoped that I would be part of these celebrations. Yes?
So the last line there says, the general spread of the light of science has already laid open to every view.
And then does it quit?
Well, I'm just, what a wonderful segue to next week's lecture by our chemistry professor, who's going to talk about science and the impact it has on these founding fathers.
Well, and what's interesting, now I'm going to forget them, but does anybody know the three pictures, the trinity of people that Mr. Jefferson said inspired him? John Locke, Francis Bacon, who's the third? Somebody help me. Isaac Newton. I believe it's Isaac Newton. And each of them, now we think of Locke primarily as a political figure, but he was also sort of a psychology figure. Dealt with natural rights and how we gained information about the world and whatever. And so, right, Mr. Jefferson particularly considered himself a product of the Enlightenment. So you have sort of Protestantism with, the Reformation has brought about a great reform, the Age of Discovery, and then the Age of Reason. And these are all revolutionary principles, even though, in my judgment, they were not revolutionary in the same way that the later Russian and Chinese revolutions were. Okay, yes?
Even so, there was a large segment of the population that remained loyal to the king or wanted to stay loyal to the king, the so-called Tories,
Yeah.
through the Revolutionary War. Is there any data as to exactly what the percentage was?
You know, I have seen people who say it's as many as 40 or 50%. The most recent, but I can't remember which book it was in, I've been trying to read several, was more like 20%. Part of it was, I mean, there were some things in the American Revolution that didn't look pretty. You know, I sort of smile when I hear about, you see somebody being tarred and feathered. Can you imagine that happening to you? Hot tar applied to your body. I mean, and there were, you know, we had a governor's house that was ransacked in Boston prior to the American Revolution. We did have threats to take away property of Tories. So any revolution is going to pit people, you know, against one another. It did not result in fortunately, I think more people probably fled to Canada than, whereas in other revolutions, many times they're just simply executed or slaughtered. But I would say probably, you know, I just read a court decision that I love. It quoted Bob Dylan as saying, "You don't need to be a weatherman to know which way the wind is blowing." And I suspect that a lot of people sort of stuck up their finger and, you know, if you were in a community that was almost all patriot, you might not openly support you, but you're probably going to lie low, and maybe vice versa. But there wasn't, the Declaration certainly projected more unity than actually existed, for sure. Anyone else? Yes?
You mentioned how other revolutions tried to almost replicate the American Revolution and failed and had a lot of dictatorship or death afterwards. What key points of the American Revolution do you think separated it and made it more?
Well, and I commend the book, and I'm not always ideologically aligned with this person, Jonathan Turley, but he has a great book called Rage in the Republic, in which he particularly contrasts the American and the French revolutions. And it makes very good reading. Again, part of it is, I think, go back to the justification for revolution was not against the world in general, not against property in general, the church in general, every institution. It was against this king exercising what the colonies thought were arbitrary power. But if it had not been for Mr. Washington, if Mr. Washington had been a Napoleon, I think he could have acted like a Napoleon. I think there was a time where we would have gladly crowned him as king, particularly, you know, in that period, the Articles of Confederation before we adopted the Constitution, things were a mess. People realized we needed stronger power, but rather than him stepping forward and saying, "I'm the answer, I'm the only one who can fix this," he headed up a constitutional convention that came up with a document with separation of powers, federalism, and bicameralism, and a lot of the other things that we have. So some of it, I mean, I hate to say it was dumb luck, but a lot of it just had to do with his character. And I think many of the others were, you know, equally, many of them were grounded in the law. Many of them most of the delegates of the Constitutional Convention and the Declaration, they had served in their states or in Congress. They had prior experience. They had theories, but they weren't simply theoretical politicians. They realized, you know, you replace one government, you don't get rid of all governments. You replace it with something that works, less oppressive. Yes?
I think one of the other big, I think Washington saved us.
Yes, I think so.
Also, our revolution was more or less fighting a foreign power.
That's right.
Whereas in France and Russia and China, they were fighting.
Yeah, again, with the reservation that there were people who still wanted to keep, you know, the connection to England, but 3,000 miles distance is enough that it's a little hard to sustain. You know, it's sort of like having a bi-coastal marriage. I've heard of things like that working, but I don't think it would work for me. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I was just rereading a children's version of Rip Van Winkle, where, if you remember, when he goes to sleep, the tavern is called King George's, and he wakes up. When he wakes up, I guess it's 20 years later, the king, they now have a picture of George Washington there, and it's no longer the King's Tavern. So things do change. Maybe one more question, is that about right? If there are any?
Are there any examples of in early American history of a president or any political figure trying to go over term limits or?
You know, the closest we have, maybe, is Aaron Burr. It's believed that Burr may have been intending to unite sort of the western states in a separate confederation. And again, the evidence is somewhat ambiguous in that, but that's probably the closest. Dr. Sawer, can you think of any other? I mean, yeah, that's probably as close as we've come. Yeah, we've been, you know, and if I can just end it, it's going to sound partisan, but the one thing we've been so good about is, and with the possible exception of 1876, which is a really unusual presidential election, we've always been good about you fight hard when you have an election, and then if you lose, you step down, and you know that's it. And I'm really concerned about, you know, concerns that, you know, well, we're gonna have federal troops, or we're gonna have ICE, or we're gonna have this or that supervising elections. If we no longer use valid elections to decide who our rulers are, we're in bad shape. Anyway, do enjoy this year, okay?